They say a girl never forgets her first kiss. For Michelle Broom, the moment came when she was just 14.
When I first met Tom, we were at a church youth group retreat, and we were around the fire, and he just kind of leaned over and planted a big one right in the mouth.
It was the summer of 1982, and 17-year-old Tom Broom was the catch of his small Jacksonville Beach, Florida town.
He was just running with a popular crowd, very athletic. Everybody knew who he was, and he got along with everybody.
But as popular as he was, Tom also had a bit of a dark streak.
He had had a couple of run-ins with police, just doing stupid prankish things, nothing super serious. I was kind of in awe of him because he was very popular, very cute. I was incredibly awkward, big glasses. After the kiss, I barely existed in his world. I would kind of admire him from afar and just go on my nerdy way.
And that was the end of Michelle's teenage crush. Until one day in the fall of 1991.
I had just graduated from college, and Tom was graduating from flight school. We ran into each other at a mutual friend's wedding, and just sparks flew. I remember being really impressed talking to him. I thought, wow, you know, here's somebody who came from a tough situation and they're making it work.
Michelle and Tom quickly became an item.
He and Michelle clicked. I remember thinking that this could be the one.
The glitch was that a couple months from that time, I had already decided that I was moving to LA to pursue my career as a performer. And I told him that after like the third or fourth date, and he immediately said, well, so am I then.
The next spring, Tom and Michelle headed west to pursue their dreams. Michelle had success singing with several local bands, while Tom easily landed a job as a flight instructor. 2 years later, Tom and Michelle knew they were meant to be. And in April 1994, they tied the knot back home in Florida.
I was excited that Michelle had found her guy and that she would be with him forever.
Our wedding was huge. We had a big reception with a killer band, and it was just a giant party. We couldn't get people to leave.
Back in California, the newlyweds quickly embarked on what seemed like an endless honeymoon.
We had various planes of his clients at our disposal, a lot. We went to Fiji, to a private island. We went deep sea fishing in Alaska. It was a really, really fun time in our marriage.
But the honeymoon wouldn't last. Nearly 10 years later, the couple's jet-setting lifestyle would take a twisted turn. By the spring of 2005, Michelle was a mother of 2, and her globe-trotting days were mostly behind her. But Tom was often away on business, so Michelle kept her cell phone handy. And one day, she got a call that would change her life forever.
It was March 3rd, 2005. I was at the car repair shop, and I got a phone call. I recognized the area code as somewhere in Georgia.
At first, Michelle thought the call was from her husband, who was flying to Atlanta that day. But the voice on the other end belonged to a district attorney, and he had shocking news.
He wanted me to know that they had had my family in surveillance for quite some time. I was completely confused. I said, I don't understand. What are you talking about? He said, you need to be extremely careful and you need to do whatever you feel you need to do to disappear. And he hung up.
The instructions were as perplexing as they were terrifying.
I didn't know what to think.
But as more information came in, Michelle soon found herself on the run.
They were telling me that he was working for the Mexican mafia.
It seemed her husband had been playing a very dangerous game.
He was a private pilot, but nobody knew what he was doing half the time.
In the spring of 1996, 10 years before the phone call that would change her life, Michelle Broom and her handsome husband, Tom, had the world at their feet.
We were very close. We were in love.
But one afternoon, 2 years into her marriage, Michelle came across a disturbing sign that things weren't entirely perfect.
I was going through some papers and I came across a bill for an attorney, and it was a pretty substantial bill, thousands of dollars. So I called the number on the bill. It turned out to be an attorney that directly deals with people who have gotten DUIs.
Michelle was stunned. Tom had never mentioned a DUI, but he had obviously gotten one a month before.
He came home and I just held the bill out to him and I said, what is this? And he was like, oh, I've been meaning to tell you, I got a DUI and I'm getting out of it. This guy's gonna take care of it for me. I was furious. I was really upset.
Still, it was just one mistake. Michelle decided to let the incident go. For the next 5 years, life carried on as usual. And by the winter of 2001, Michelle and Tom realized they were ready for their next adventure, parenthood.
I'm entering my 30s, the biological clock is ticking. So we decided, to give it a shot. And I got pregnant almost right away. Tom was just over the moon, so happy.
To prepare for the baby, Michelle took a steady job at a record label, and Tom began flying for several high-profile clients. The job meant Tom was often gone, but he was also pulling in 6 figures.
We were both very excited about our lives and careers and the baby coming.
But as Michelle's pregnancy wore on, she quickly realized that Tom had no intention of slowing down.
He was still taking off and taking his surf trips and his golf trips and his skiing trips, in addition to the trips that he was doing for his job.
He would get home from trips, come back, spend an hour, and then off he would go to be with his mates, off to the bar.
Michelle soon noticed that Tom was drinking heavily, and to make matters worse, he seemed to be developing another bad habit.
I overheard him on the phone, and he thought that nobody could hear him, but he was talking to somebody about placing a bet on teams that I'd never heard of before. I asked him about it, and I was like, well, then who were you betting with? Oh, it was, my buddy's bookie. And I'm like, bookie?
Concerned, Michelle asked Tom to cut back on the gambling, and Tom promised he would rein it in. In January 2002, after the birth of their son, he kept his word.
He was just absolutely in love with our son, and I believed at that time that, okay, our lives have changed, and he gets it, and he was home more the first month or two.
But when their son was just 3 months old, things took a turn for the worse.
Tom was in Mexico on a business trip, and he sometimes had trouble getting through the phone connections to check his voicemail from there. So he called me at one point and said, I can't get my voicemail.
Tom asked Michelle to check his messages, and when she did, she heard something completely unexpected.
There was a message from a woman. She was, hey, sweetie, I'm so sorry I missed you. Call me whenever you can, and we'll arrange to see each other. So I called Tom, and I said, who is this woman? And I said her name, and there was dead silence.
Tom refused to discuss the matter over the phone, but the next day he came home and came clean.
He was white when he walked in the door, and he said that he'd only seen her a couple of times, and she was a flight attendant, and they would occasionally connect if they were in the same city. I just looked at him and I thought, oh my, what are you, I had no idea you were even capable of this. I would never do this.
Michelle was devastated, but she wasn't ready to throw in the towel.
For better, for worse, I was brought up in that, you're married, you take a vow, and you go through trials and you make it work.
Michelle insisted on counseling, and for a while, things got better. In 2004, just after their 10th wedding anniversary, Michelle realized she was pregnant again.
My thought was, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but okay, we're having a baby, we're gonna make this work.
But just 1 month into her pregnancy, Michelle's hopes for a renewed marriage were shattered, as Tom reverted back to his old ways, and much, much worse.
Tom's drug use was just as bad as his drinking.
He was scary. He seemed like he was possessed.
I just had this overwhelming feeling that he was hiding something.
By the spring of 2004, 10 years into her roller coaster marriage, Michelle Broom could only watch as her husband's self-destructive behavior escalated. Everyone was concerned.
Tom was not in a good place. He was drinking a lot. He was away a lot. He wasn't comfortable. And it was really hard to watch.
That December, Michelle went into labor with her daughter. What should have been a joyful time seemed almost agonizing for Tom.
It was like he was jumping out of his skin being there. He couldn't sit still. He was constantly on the phone. He was pacing, even after the baby was born.
It was disturbing behavior, but Michelle would soon learn that Tom was hiding a much darker secret. On March 3rd, 2005, 9 weeks after the birth of their daughter, Tom was flying to Atlanta on business. Michelle was at the mechanics when she got an alarming call from a district attorney in Georgia.
He said, "Your family's been under surveillance for quite some time now. I know that you know nothing." And he said, "Your husband has been arrested. We have him in custody. He was found with a large amount of cocaine on his airplane."
The DA couldn't give Michelle any more details over the phone, but his final words were chilling.
And he said, "You and the kids are in danger. You need to disappear."
Frantic and confused, Michelle raced to pick up her children. She then made a beeline for the bank. And that's when she got another horrible surprise.
I went to try and withdraw money, and it was gone. There was no money in there. It just didn't make sense. I called my sister, Renee. She was working, and I just said, "Drop everything."
When I got to Michelle, she looked like she was in a complete fog. Everyone's main concern was getting her to a place where nobody could find her. We went to my younger sister's house because she lived in a gated community.
2 hours after she arrived at her sister's, Michelle got a phone call from Tom.
He was at the county jail, and I'm trying to ask questions. What happened? Who were you flying with? Who was the person that called me? Why were we under surveillance?
Tom refused to get into it over the phone.
He kept saying, "I can't talk too much because they're listening. Get me home so that we can sort this out, and I'll tell you everything."
Tom's bail had been set at $250,000. Michelle was forced to borrow the money from friends. 3 weeks later, Tom Broom was back in California.
A friend of ours picked him up at the airport and brought him over to my sister's apartment. And he walked in the door. He had this look on his face, like a sheepish look on his face, like, "I got caught. I'm really dreading having to tell you this." He said there were drugs. The gambling was just outrageous. And he said that the money was gone. He had gambled it all away.
Desperate to replace the couple's squandered savings, Tom began taking flights for someone he had met in LA.
This guy had offered him cash to fly these flights from Los Angeles to Atlanta and back. No passengers on the plane, just suitcases, no questions asked. And every time he made one of these flights, he would make a giant chunk of cash, like tens of thousands of dollars.
During his last flight, Tom had been stopped by customs.
They started questioning him. He gave them all the paperwork on the plane and his license and everything, like it was just a routine check. And they said, "Is it okay if we search your plane?" They asked him to open a certain compartment on the plane. He said he didn't have the keys to it. They brought out dogs, and the dogs immediately went to that section of the plane and started going crazy.
I think it was like 4 suitcases filled with pure cocaine. I mean, it's not even cut with anything.
He was caught with 65 kilos, which has a street value of a couple $1 million.
Tom insisted he didn't know what was in the suitcases. But he did have one more horrible admission to make. The man he was flying for was also a member of the notorious and dangerous Mexican mafia.
Obviously, I understood at that point why our lives were in danger.
In March 2005, Michelle Broom's entire world had been turned upside down. Her husband Tom stood accused of drug trafficking and was on house arrest. His claims of innocence were starting to ring hollow.
I said, you know, if somebody's offering you that much cash to fly a plane with no people on it, with locked suitcases, something's going on.
The stress with Michelle was tangible. She tried to hold it together, but it was really, really hard.
The couple now needed to hire an expensive defense team. But Tom's irresponsible behavior had left them penniless.
We were looking at financial ruin, basically.
On the advice of an attorney, Michelle started divorce proceedings.
It was unclear yet whether or not the government was going to come in and seize any of our assets. I was told that if I filed for divorce, if we had any money left over, I could possibly allocate it as child support.
It was a heartbreaking scene, but it was just the beginning. When the couple met with Tom's defense team that April, Michelle realized that her husband had no chance.
They could link him to dozens of these flights, and it had been going on for quite some time, over a year at least. They had conversations recorded. They had instances where he was flying and would change the tail number of the plane mid-route, or change the destination of the plane mid-route, which is a common thing that drug runners do.
Even worse, Tom had also hand-delivered the suitcases to their recipient in Georgia.
He knew the guy's name that he was meeting with. He had a regular meeting point with him. I was blown away. At one point, I looked up and I had this feeling looking at him like, I don't even know who you are.
In July of 2005, after more than 10 years of marriage, Michelle and Tom's divorce was finalized. Meanwhile, Tom, still on house arrest, was falling apart.
It's like the demons that were inside of him just took over. Everything just came back to the surface. All of the addictions, all of the anger, all of the anxiety, the need to escape from it all.
He would go on these drinking rampages and have drugs delivered to the house. He would go on these binges, take pills. I mean, there were times he'd be sitting on the couch twitching. Michelle came to that point and she realized she had to revoke bail on Tom. His behavior was so erratic.
Just before Thanksgiving 2005, Tom Broom went back to jail. That winter, he pled guilty to possession of narcotics with an intent to distribute. There was no trial, and Tom was granted leniency for cooperating with the investigation. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison.
It was heartbreaking on many different levels, both watching him as a human being, somebody I care about, watching a marriage completely disappear.
Michelle has traveled a long, hard road since that first kiss almost 30 years ago. Today, she's a single parent. And while she continues to struggle financially, she has an unwavering support system in her family.
The bond that I have and that my kids have now with their grandparents and my sisters and my brother-in-laws is incredible. I could not have made it through this with my sanity somewhat intact without them.
And now, with strength and courage, Michelle is ready to face her next hurdle, Tom's release.
I've talked to him at length about what's going to happen when he gets out. I want him to be a part of the kids' lives, but I will definitely be in control of the situation as far as monitoring how healthy he is. I have forgiven Tom. It's a waste of energy not to, but I haven't forgotten.
Cynthia Castile never planned for heartbreak. She always believed in happily ever after.
I'm probably one of the world's best optimists. I love being a wife, so I just figured I would always be married for the rest of my life.
But after a devastating divorce, Cynthia's heart seemed forever on the mend.
Cynthia's first marriage broke up because her husband had an affair with one of Cynthia's friends.
It was very devastating to have that come to an end and then feel like a failure. Why couldn't I make it work?
7 years had done little to repair the damage, so in April of 1998, 45-year-old Cynthia left her small town in Oregon to embark on a new adventure.
I was speaking with a close girlfriend, and she said to me, well, Cynthia, what about, like a job on a cruise ship?
Cynthia found a customer relations position on an Alaskan cruise line. Soon, she was surrounded by new sights, new cities, and a new man, the ship's chef, Wayne Yi Chin. From the moment they met, Wayne came on strong.
I was trying to kind of make a bouquet out of the flowers that was there, and Wayne came by. He goes, oh, he said, those are pretty. Are those yours? I said, no, no one ever sends me flowers. And when I went down to my cabin that afternoon to change my clothes, there was a bouquet of flowers with a card from him. The next day, we actually talked, and he told me he had every intentions of making me his wife. I'm looking at him thinking, okay, whatever.
Wayne told Cynthia he had learned to cook in the Navy, where he still served as a reserve officer.
That made me feel good because he is patriotic. He was doing something to help his fellow man.
Wayne seemed perfect, and by now, Cynthia was eager to open her heart again.
She called and said, I've met somebody. We just fell in love.
I hadn't had a man pay attention to me in over, 7 years, and he was wonderful. He was gregarious, he was sensitive, he was fun.
And Wayne was open about his own painful past.
Wayne had been through a very horrendous divorce. He had 3 children, and he had found her in bed with another man, and he had been terribly hurt. I could identify with that because I had been in that position too.
But that wouldn't stop Wayne from trying again. In September of 1999, after 1 month together at sea, he proposed to Cynthia.
Wayne said, come in the cooler for a minute. Then he dropped an emerald and diamond ring in my hand and said, this is my promise that I'll be faithful to you for the rest of your life. And I was so excited to be able to say, I'm going to be somebody's wife again.
But the happy glow of their new engagement didn't last long. Soon after the ship docked in San Francisco, Wayne told Cynthia he had received some devastating news. His 2 college-age children had died in a car crash.
They were going to surprise their dad, and that they had been killed in this horrible accident. I remember holding him and him crying, my babies are gone.
To make matters worse, Wayne said his ex-wife hadn't even bothered to call. He said he got the news from his daughter's friend and had already missed the funerals.
I couldn't believe that somebody would be so cruel as to do this. It was just heart-wrenching.
Despite the tragedy, Wayne was still eager to marry Cynthia right away.
He said people's lives cross for a reason, and that I was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and that he wanted me with him for the rest of his life.
2 weeks later, Cynthia and Wayne tied the knot in a small ceremony in Cynthia's hometown of Eagle Creek, Oregon.
We catered our own wedding reception. My mom did the cake, and I was real excited that I'm going to have that special connection with that person.
She was absolutely beautiful. She had a glow because she was happy.
The newlyweds quickly settled into life back on land, and in January of 2000, they found new jobs together as managers at a motel on the Oregon coast.
Our apartment was behind the reception area. I was supposed to do the front counter. He was supposed to do the maintenance and the yards and things like that.
But the newlywed bliss wouldn't last long. On Valentine's Day, just 4 months after their wedding, the couple got a surprise visit from an unwelcome guest.
A buzzer in our apartment rang, and there was a Lincoln County sheriff standing there. And I said, well, can I help you? And he said, do you know Wayne Chin? And he walked out, and so the sheriff told him he had a warrant for his arrest. It was just like somebody had just kicked me in the gut.
Cynthia would soon find out that not only was her new husband a wanted man, he was keeping secrets that would jeopardize their jobs and their marriage.
Wayne Chin is a mastermind of being able to manipulate women.
For Cynthia Castile, Valentine's Day of 2000 was memorable for all the wrong reasons. Her husband, Wayne Chin, had just been arrested, right in the lobby of the Oregon motel they managed.
Wayne said, "There's got to be a mistake." He told me that our housekeeper and her boyfriend had used a debit card of one of the guests and had signed his name to the card.
But after arresting him for theft, police discovered that this was far from his first offense.
They ran his name and discovered that he had a warrant out for his arrest from Lewis County, Washington.
In Washington, Wayne was convicted of a forgery charge, and the court required him to do a certain number of things. Well, apparently he didn't do those things, and he faced a bail jumping charge.
But Wayne told Cynthia there was a logical explanation, claiming a vindictive ex-girlfriend had falsely accused him of stealing her financial information.
He told me that he had purchased a car with his previous girlfriend, and then she tried to back out of the deal. But he told me he had taken care of it. He didn't understand why this was happening.
He kept saying, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do anything wrong. But I kept telling Mom, then why has he been arrested?
But Cynthia was confident in her man.
Cynthia loved him, he loved her, and so she ended up writing checks for $14,000 to defend the man she loves from this criminal charge.
5 weeks later, Wayne was free, and married life was back on track. In April of 2001, the couple found new jobs together once again, this time managing a popular seafood restaurant in a nearby town.
We set up a menu where the ocean meets the plate was our little catchphrase. And, and here was a dream come true for both of us.
But the dream had one flaw. Wayne often had to leave home for Naval Reserve training.
Cynthia would tell me that he was spending the weekend up in Washington. And I'm going, there's no water up there. Why is he going to Central Washington as a Naval Reserve?
He started supposedly getting emails from a commander in the Navy. She showed them to me. I said, wait a minute. If it's an official military email, it's not going to come from a Yahoo account. It's going to come from a military account. Something's not right.
But once again, Cynthia gave Wayne the benefit of the doubt, until that June, when the law paid them another visit.
We were just getting ready to close for the evening, and a county sheriff shows up. And it's like, oh my gosh, now they're going to haul Wayne off again. The sheriff takes Wayne, and I sit down on the bench behind the reception area at the restaurant and cry.
Wayne had skipped yet another court date for his forgery charge. This time, he would spend 8 months in a Washington state prison.
I was very, very unhappy. But all married couples do go through good times, bad times.
Anytime that she went up to visit him, she just did not sound like her normal self. You could hear the sadness in her voice after that.
When Wayne was released from prison in August of 2002, Cynthia was there to pick him up. She was determined to put the past behind them. She was about to turn 50, and Wayne wanted to throw her a party.
He said, yeah, let's, plan the party. I will find a place to have it at. I'll pay for it. I'll make sure she gets there.
But the night before the celebration, Wayne got a disappointing call.
The phone rang, and he goes, well, that was my parole officer from Lewis County. They're coming to do an in-home visit tomorrow. And I said, Wayne, my party's tomorrow. What am I supposed to do? He goes, oh, just go. It'll be fine. He goes, you just go in the hotel, and they have it all set up for you.
The next day, Cynthia drove alone to her party, 2 hours away. But what greeted her there was a terrible surprise, one that would destroy her faith in her husband forever.
He lied to the entire family. It was like a punch in the gut for all of us.
So I went back out and I sat in the car and I cried. And I cried and I cried and I cried.
It was January 13th, 2003, Cynthia Castile's 50th birthday celebration. Her husband Wayne had planned a fancy party, even though a parole visit meant he couldn't be there.
I travel the 2.5 hours up from the coast to the hotel restaurant where the party's supposed to be, and I go into the hostess desk, tell them who I am and what's supposed to be there, and there's no reservations.
They said, "We have no record of a party being booked for today. There's been no payment made. We don't know who you're talking about."
So I went back out and I sat in the car and I cried. And I cried and I cried and I cried.
When Cynthia returned home, Wayne tried to persuade her the hotel made a mistake. But she wasn't buying it. Her blind faith in Wayne had been shattered.
So the next day when he went to work, I got the number of his parole officer for Lewis County and called her and said, just wanted to know, do you do out-of-state in-home visits? And she says, no.
That evening, Cynthia confronted her husband.
I said, so Wayne, how was that visit yesterday? Everything go okay? He said, it went great. And I said, well, that's funny. I talked to her today and they don't do out-of-state in-home visits. So backpedaling really fast, he told me, well, it was one of her other associates. And so I just finally said, whatever.
I think it was the final straw. I think that started her really reconsidering things, really questioning everything even more.
But despite her growing doubts, Cynthia couldn't face the prospect of another divorce. So she swallowed her pride and gave Wayne one last chance.
It's because you believe so strongly in this person. It overshadows that unbelief. And that's what was happening. I mean, this man told me he loved me for the rest of my life.
2 months later, in March of 2003, Wayne found a new job opportunity at a restaurant in Colorado, over 1,000 miles away.
I told Wayne that there was no sense in me quitting my job. I might as well stay till June and then I would come and join him.
For months, the couple talked by phone, planning their future together in the Rockies. Until one day in late August, when Cynthia got a strange call from her husband.
He goes, have you checked your email? And I go, well, why? He goes, you just need to check your email.
Cynthia hung up, logged on, and sure enough, there was an email from Wayne asking for a divorce.
I broke down and I cried. All my dreams were now all gone. I was nobody's wife again.
But Cynthia's heartbreak was just beginning. In early January 2004, she phoned Wayne at work to tell him the divorce papers were ready.
The owner of the place came on the phone and she says, well, he doesn't work here anymore. I fired him in December, but he still is here in Estes Park with his wife, Kim. And I said, well, I'm his wife. She says, well, he's got 2 of them, doesn't he?
Cynthia had lived with Wayne's petty crimes and even forgiven his lies. But to her, the bigamy was the ultimate betrayal. Little did she know, it was just the tip of the iceberg. As Cynthia poured through Wayne's personal documents, she soon discovered that the man she'd opened her heart to was little more than a common crook.
Wayne Chin has a criminal record in Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. He went to work at a lumber mill as a security guard. He was accused of burning down the lumber mill, and we know he actually went to prison for that.
And Wayne wasn't a naval officer or in the reserves. He had been discharged from the Navy decades earlier.
So the whole time that Wayne was doing the naval reserves was all bogus. I was completely dumbfounded that somebody could figure this all out and not think that they would get caught.
It seemed that everything Cynthia had loved about Wayne was a lie, but she was about to get even.
I thought there might be 2 women, 3 women, but there's 4, there's 5, there's 6, there's 7.
He didn't have any remorse, he don't care. And I had had enough.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In January of 2004, Cynthia Castile was stunned to discover that her husband Wayne Chin was a bigamist, living a double life with another wife in Colorado. But that was far from all.
Here I was caught up in this web of all this mystery, all these unanswered questions.
Cynthia soon learned that Wayne had a long history of manipulating and marrying women.
You start looking at court documents and you realize there isn't 2, there isn't 3, there's 4, there's 5, there's 6, there's 7, and that is just the women he's married.
Determined to unravel Wayne's lies once and for all, Cynthia reached out to the women in his past.
I sat down and I wrote a letter listing all of these women's email address and put all the details of the bigamy. And I contacted the ex-wife, and we played a lot of I'll tell you if you tell me.
It soon became clear how Wayne won so many hearts.
Wayne Chin is a mastermind of being able to manipulate women. One of the things he says is that he's in the Navy, and that gives him dignity and cachet, and it's one of the things that they're drawn to, a man in uniform. He comes in at the right time, he woos them, he tells them the things that they want to hear, especially in that time in their lives where they feel vulnerable, and then he marries them, and once he marries them, he has access to their finances, just like any husband or wife does.
And when things began to get complicated, it seemed that Wayne had a clever exit plan.
One of his big cons with one of his fiancées is that he got called up to Iraq. So he goes to Iraq, and while he's in Iraq, he's calling her in the middle of the night when she's asleep because Iraq is on a different time zone.
Hey, you. Hold on just a minute. Roger that, Enterprise 6-7. Message confirmed. Secondary is on its way to you as I speak. Anyway, just calling you.
And she's back in this country trying to, keep him supported by writing checks to pay his bills. Meanwhile, he's off somewhere else, married to another woman.
So you let this pathological liar into your life that messes up everything, and there's no law against lying. So if there's no law against lying, then how do we stop this person?
I investigate a lot of crooks, but usually it has to do with something that's an object, like a car or credit cards. But this case is different because he's using love. Love is the thing that he uses to take advantage of people.
And there was one lie that was the most disturbing of all. Wayne's 2 children were very much alive.
That is one of the key parts of his con. By telling these women that his 2 children have died in a car wreck, he's opening himself up. And they want to give him their shoulder to cry on. And it's one of the things that bonds them the most to him, that he's lived through this tragedy.
I was just literally floored. Why would anybody use their children like that to further their own cause? Why would anybody do that?
It was the final straw for Cynthia. She marched down to the sheriff's office and filed bigamy charges against Wayne.
I think Cynthia had come to realize that he really was a liar, a cheat, and a scumbag. And I think it was probably more of a relief to her.
In July 2004, Wayne Yi Chin was found guilty of bigamy. He spent 10 days in jail and paid a $500 fine, the maximum penalty that Oregon law allowed. This time, Cynthia didn't pay his legal fees.
And when I walked out of the room, then I just completely fell all apart. It was time to let it all go, just to melt away and then be strong again.
Their divorce became official on October 26, 2004.
I was very relieved that he was gone, that he wasn't going to be a part of my life anymore. But I wasn't anybody's wife anymore. That's the heartache that I have.
Today, Cynthia is no longer caring for her man, but she hasn't stopped caring for others.
I live with my mom here. Both my girls live within 6 miles, and my grandchildren. I'm head of dining services at an assisted living center, and enjoy my job very much. Life is just good.
Though Cynthia is dating, she's unsure that she will ever marry again.
It still kind of haunts her. She was very vulnerable to him. I do hope that one day she will meet the man of her dreams.
It's like, well, here's my background. Feel free to check it, because you better believe I'm going to check yours. I'm not going to put myself in that position again.
The phone rang just after midnight, the kind of ring that cuts through sleep like a blade. sharp and unwelcome, echoing longer than it should, because in towns like this, calls at that hour never carried good news, and when the receiver was lifted, there was only a pause, a breath on the other end, and then a sentence that would be repeated for decades, whispered, shouted, printed in headlines, and carved into memory. She didn't come home. California, 1998. A year of sunshine and static, of strip malls and quiet cul-de-sacs, of neighborhoods where porch lights stayed on past midnight not because of fear, but habit. This was a place where nothing happened, until suddenly everything did. One woman vanished between a grocery store parking lot and her front door, a distance so short it barely deserved a thought, a routine so ordinary it left no room for suspicion, and yet by morning her name would be everywhere, attached to two words that would refuse to let go: mysterious disappearance. Her car sat where she left it, engine cold, groceries still in the trunk, milk beginning to sour under the California heat, keys gone, purse gone, no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no screams reported, no witnesses stepping forward, just a silence so complete it felt staged. Detectives arrived before sunrise, walking the perimeter, scanning the asphalt, crouching near faint tire marks that could have belonged to anyone, anywhere, at any time. They spoke in low voices, already sensing what this was becoming, already aware that the first hours were slipping through their fingers. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains, doors cracked open just enough to see uniforms and yellow tape, neighbors replaying the same questions in their heads. How could someone vanish here? How could it happen so fast? How could nobody see anything? And the word cold case hadn't been spoken yet, but it was already forming, hovering over the scene like a shadow that hadn't learned its shape. She was 32. A routine life. A predictable schedule. No known enemies. No history of disappearing acts. She worked, she shopped, she came home. That night was no different, until it was. Security cameras from nearby businesses showed her car pulling in, showed her walking out with plastic bags cutting into her fingers, showed nothing else. One frame she existed, the next she didn't, as if the footage itself had swallowed her whole. Detectives canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking the same questions again and again. Did you hear anything? Did you see anyone unfamiliar? Did you notice a car idling, headlights off, engine running? And every answer came back the same. No, 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 a chorus of uncertainty that felt rehearsed but wasn't, because when violence arrives quietly, it leaves nothing behind but doubt. By day 3, the media arrived. Vans lined the street. Cameras pointed at her house. Reporters spoke in measured tones about a missing woman, about a community on edge, about police refusing to rule out foul play. Her photograph appeared on television screens, frozen in a smile that now felt accusatory, asking why, asking how, asking who. Tip lines opened. Calls flooded in. Most went nowhere. Police found nothing in her financial records, no sudden withdrawals, no suspicious transactions. Her phone had gone silent shortly after she left the store. Last signal pinging off a tower less than a mile away, an echo rather than a direction. Her family clung to hope, repeating that she wouldn't just leave, that something had happened, that someone knew something, and detectives nodded, because they believed it too, even if belief wasn't evidence. Weeks passed. Then months. Leads dried up. Witnesses recanted or remembered differently. A man seen walking a dog became 2 men, then none. A dark sedan became a light-colored truck, then vanished altogether. The case file grew thicker while the truth retreated further, buried under speculation and time. The phrase California 1998 cold case began to surface, quietly at first, then with resignation. Investigators revisited the scene, rewalked the path from car to door, measured steps, counted seconds, tried to imagine the impossible, how someone could intercept her in that narrow window, how control could be asserted without noise, how fear could be weaponized so efficiently. They theorized. They argued. They split into camps. Stranger or someone she knew. Crime of opportunity or something planned. Random or targeted. Every answer created more questions. A year later, the case was officially labeled inactive. Not closed. Not solved. Just waiting. Waiting for a tip that would never come. Waiting for technology that didn't exist yet. Waiting for someone to slip, to talk, to confess. The community moved on, but not really. Porch lights stayed on longer now. Parents walked their children to school. The grocery store parking lot felt different, like a place where something had been taken and never returned. Then, almost as an afterthought, evidence from the scene, fragments so small they barely mattered at the time, was boxed, labeled, and stored. Fibers. Touch DNA. Trace material that couldn't speak yet. It sat on a shelf while years stacked up, while headlines faded, while the woman at the center of it all became a name people recognized but couldn't place. By the late 2000s, the case was revisited again, pulled from the archives by detectives who hadn't been there in 1998, who saw it with fresh eyes and modern tools. They read reports, studied grainy photos, listened to old tapes where voices sounded younger, more hopeful. They noticed inconsistencies. Small things. Things that might have mattered more if they'd been understood sooner. A new push. A new appeal to the public. Another wave of tips. Another wave of disappointment. And still, the question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. How could someone vanish so completely? How could a life be erased in the time it takes to carry groceries across a parking lot? Years turned into decades. The phrase cold case hardened, no longer a warning but a label, something static, something finished. Until one day, long after most had stopped paying attention, a sample was taken off that shelf, logged into a system that hadn't existed in 1998, and run against millions of profiles, a silent comparison happening in the background, unnoticed, unannounced. And then, unexpectedly, a match appeared. Not a name yet. Not an answer. Just a signal. A hit where there had been nothing before. A spark in a case that had gone dark for over 20 years. Detectives stared at the screen, reading and rereading the result, aware that this was either the breakthrough they'd waited for, or another dead end disguised as hope. Because in cold cases, even DNA doesn't always tell the truth. And somewhere, without knowing it, someone who had lived freely for decades was about to feel the past catch up, fast and unforgiving, as a case everyone thought was dead began, quietly, to breathe again. The database did not announce itself with sirens or flashing lights. It never does. It simply returned a line of text, a probability score, a quiet confirmation that something left behind in 1998 had found a voice decades later. And when the detective leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen, he understood immediately that this was the moment every cold case waits for. The instant when the past stops being theoretical and starts becoming dangerous for someone, somewhere. The sample was partial, degraded by time, heat, and neglect, collected from an object no one thought much about back then. Something that passed through too many hands to seem important. But now the numbers aligned just enough to trigger a flag. Not a suspect. Not yet. A familial link. A near match. The kind of result that opens doors instead of closing cases. The kind that forces investigators to ask a new question rather than answer an old one. Who does this DNA belong to, and why was it there? The case was pulled from storage again, its cardboard boxes carried into fluorescent-lit rooms by officers who hadn't even joined the force when the woman disappeared. They laid out photographs, maps, transcripts, and timelines like archaeologists reconstructing a ruin, careful not to disturb the fragile logic of the original investigation while knowing it had failed. They listened to recorded interviews, the voices grainy and tense, witnesses unsure even then, and they noticed patterns that had been invisible before, not because they were hidden, but because no one had known how to look. The familial match pointed to a man arrested years earlier for an unrelated offense. His DNA entered into the system as part of routine procedure, a bureaucratic detail that now felt monumental. He lived hundreds of miles away. Different city. Different life. No prior connection to the victim on paper. No obvious reason to have been there that night. And yet the numbers didn't lie. The science didn't care about coincidence. Investigators began quietly building a shadow profile, tracking his movements in the late 1990s, reconstructing a life lived mostly off the radar. Employment records, old addresses, traffic citations, a patchwork of existence stitched together from databases that hadn't talked to each other back then. In 1998, he would have been in his mid-30s, mobile, recently unemployed, drifting between jobs, between places, between identities that never stayed long enough to draw attention. They learned he had been in California that year. Not documented, not officially, but enough traces existed to suggest proximity. A utility bill in a nearby county. A short-term lease that ended abruptly. A witness from an unrelated case who remembered his face but not his name. Nothing concrete. Nothing arrest-worthy. Just enough to raise the temperature in the room every time his file was opened. Meanwhile, the victim's family was notified that the case was being reviewed again, that new technology had opened new possibilities, that they should be cautiously hopeful. They had heard this before. Every cold case family has. Hope had learned to be quiet in that house, careful not to overstay its welcome. Still, when detectives mentioned DNA, the word landed differently, heavier, more real, like something that could finally cut through the fog. The media caught wind of the renewed activity and descended again, recycling old headlines with new verbs re-examined, reopened, retested. Photos from 1998 reappeared on screens, the victim's face now dated by fashion and resolution, but no less haunting. Reporters spoke about advances in forensic science, about justice delayed, about questions that refused to die. The community listened, remembering where they had been when she vanished, remembering how safe everything had felt before. Investigators knew better than to rush. Familial DNA leads have a way of collapsing if handled carelessly. They needed confirmation, corroboration, something physical to tie the suspect not just to the genetic material, but to the crime itself. They needed motive, opportunity, behavior. They needed to understand how a man could intersect so briefly with a woman's life and erase it entirely. They revisited the original timeline with new eyes, focusing on the narrow window between the grocery store and her home. Traffic patterns from 1998 were reconstructed using old planning documents. The suspect's possible routes were mapped, overlaid with known addresses and businesses he frequented. A pattern emerged, faint but persistent, suggesting he passed through that area more often than chance would allow. Old witnesses were re-interviewed. Some had forgotten everything. Some remembered new details they swore they'd never mentioned before. Memory, unreliable and malleable, offered fragments rather than facts. One neighbor recalled a man leaning against a car that night, smoking, watching. Another remembered headlights turning off too quickly. None could identify a face. All could describe a feeling, the sense that something had been off even then. The suspect was contacted under the pretense of a routine inquiry, his reaction measured carefully by detectives trained to read what isn't said. He was calm, cooperative, almost too willing to talk. He denied ever knowing the victim, denied being in that neighborhood, denied everything with a confidence that bordered on rehearsed. He asked why they were contacting him now, after all these years, and when they mentioned advances in DNA, there was a pause, brief but unmistakable, a silence that hung just long enough to be noticed. Still, it wasn't enough. Not for an arrest. Not yet. The law demands more than intuition, more than probability. It demands a bridge between science and story, between numbers and narrative. So investigators waited, watched, and kept digging, hoping time itself would provide what it always does eventually, a mistake. They found one in an old arrest report from another state, a minor charge, nothing violent, but the details mattered. The location, the time, the behavior described by the officer. A tendency to linger, to follow, to insert himself into spaces where he didn't belong. It wasn't proof, but it was pattern, and patterns are what cold cases live on. As the net tightened, the suspect seemed to sense it. He changed routines, stopped answering calls, moved again. But the past was faster now, propelled by databases and cooperation agreements that didn't exist in 1998. Warrants were prepared quietly. Surveillance began. Every movement logged. Every interaction noted. The DNA match was rerun, refined, strengthened with new samples collected legally, carefully, waiting for the moment when probability became certainty. That moment arrived without ceremony. A discarded item. A routine collection. A lab report that removed the word familial and replaced it with direct. The numbers aligned perfectly this time. No margin. No ambiguity. The genetic material left behind in 1998 belonged to him. For detectives, the confirmation was electric and terrifying all at once. They were holding the key to a mystery that had haunted a community for decades, but keys opened doors, and behind this one waited a truth that could not be put back once revealed. They coordinated with prosecutors, reviewed every step, anticipated every defense argument, knowing that cold case arrests collapse under scrutiny as easily as they rise. The arrest came suddenly, early morning. A knock on a door that hadn't been connected to that grocery store parking lot in years. Handcuffs clicking shut on wrists that had never been marked by that night until now. Neighbors watched, confused, unaware they were witnessing the end of one story and the beginning of another. Headlines exploded within hours. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA match leads to sudden arrest. The word spread faster than the details, faster than the truth could catch up. And as cameras flashed and reporters spoke of closure, detectives knew better. An arrest is not an ending. It is an accusation backed by evidence, nothing more, nothing less. Because the question still lingered, louder now than ever. What really happened in that space between the car and the door, and was the man in custody the whole story, or just the part that survived long enough to be found? And as the suspect was led away, expression unreadable, the past finally had a face again, but the answers it promised were still locked behind silence, waiting to see who would speak first. The interrogation room was smaller than it needed to be, deliberately so, a space designed to press inward, to remind anyone sitting inside that there was no room left to run, and when the suspect was led in, hands cuffed, posture stiff, the weight of 26 years settled into the air like dust disturbed after a long silence. He sat down slowly, eyes scanning the room, the camera, the table, already calculating what this moment required of him, already aware that whatever he said next would echo backward through time. Detectives didn't rush. They never do when history is involved. They began with neutral ground, name, date of birth, current address, questions that sounded procedural but served a deeper purpose, establishing rhythm, watching his breathing, his cadence, the way his jaw tightened when California was mentioned, the way his gaze dropped when the year 1998 slipped casually into conversation. These were not confessions. These were tells, small fractures in a surface he had maintained for decades. They laid out the evidence carefully, not all at once, never revealing the full hand, starting with the least threatening details. He had been in the state that year. He had lived not far from where the woman disappeared. He had no alibi that could be verified. He nodded along, offered explanations, said people forget things, said the past blurs, said he moved around a lot back then. Every answer was reasonable. Too reasonable. Built to deflect rather than clarify. Then they mentioned the DNA. Not the match. Not the lab report. Just the word. DNA. It hung there, heavy, unavoidable. His shoulders shifted. He swallowed. Asked what they meant. Asked how that was possible. Asked who they were comparing him to. The questions came fast now, no longer measured, no longer detached. The detectives let the silence work, watched him fill it with his own anxiety. They told him the science didn't forget. That skin cells and fibers remembered even when people didn't. That something from that night had survived long enough to speak now. He laughed once, a short, hollow sound, said science makes mistakes, said labs get it wrong all the time, said this was ridiculous, said he wanted a lawyer. The interview ended there, as it always does when denial hardens into fear. Outside the room, prosecutors reviewed the footage, the statements, the timelines. They knew the defense would argue contamination, chain of custody, coincidence. Cold cases invite skepticism by their nature. Evidence ages. Memories rot. Jurors hesitate. So they kept digging, not backward this time, but outward, expanding the circle around the suspect, searching for echoes of behavior that matched the crime. They found them in old police reports, incidents dismissed as minor at the time. A woman followed to her car, a complaint about someone watching from across the street, a late-night encounter that ended without violence but left fear behind. Different cities. Different years. Same description. Same eyes. Same sense of being selected rather than stumbled upon. Patterns, once invisible, now unmistakable. The victim's life was reconstructed in parallel, every habit examined for vulnerability, every routine scrutinized. She shopped on the same nights, parked in the same row, walked the same path. Predictability, investigators realized, had been her only mistake. The suspect didn't need to know her. He only needed to notice her. As the case moved toward court, the community relived the disappearance in slow motion. News segments replayed footage of the parking lot, analysts pointing at shadows and angles, narrating possibilities as if they were facts. Social media filled the gaps with speculation, theories stacking on theories, some accusing, some defending, all desperate for resolution. The suspect's face became public, dissected, judged, compared to old composite sketches that suddenly looked prophetic. But behind the noise, detectives focused on the quiet details, the ones that don't make headlines. The way the suspect had changed his name slightly over the years. The way he avoided long-term employment. The way he moved when attention lingered too long. These weren't crimes, but they were survival strategies, the behavior of someone accustomed to disappearing before questions could form. The defense prepared its counter-narrative, painting the suspect as a victim of technological overreach, a man ensnared by a system eager to close old files regardless of truth. They questioned why it took so long, why no one saw anything, Why no physical evidence tied him directly to violence? They emphasized absence. They emphasized doubt. Prosecutors responded by reframing time itself as the witness. They argued that delay did not equal error, that science had caught up to silence, that the absence of evidence in 1998 was not proof of innocence, but proof of limitation. They spoke of patience, of persistence, of justice that waits rather than forgets. In private moments, the victim's family wrestled with a different reality. The man accused of destroying their lives was now a name, a face, a presence they could not escape. Relief tangled with dread. Answers promised pain. Silence had been cruel, but truth threatened to be worse. Still, they attended every hearing, listened to every argument, watched every procedural step, determined to see this through no matter the cost. As trial dates were set and motions filed, something unexpected happened. Another tip came in. Then another. People who had known the suspect years ago began to speak, their memories sharpened by headlines, by recognition, by guilt. One recalled him coming home late, clothes dirty, agitated. Another remembered a sudden move shortly after the disappearance. None had connected it then. All felt the weight of that now. Each statement tightened the narrative, not into certainty, but into coherence. The story began to make sense in a way it never had before. Not because every question was answered, but because the chaos had a center now, a gravity pulling fragments into alignment. Yet one question refused to settle, lingering beneath every development, every press conference, every court filing. If the case was solved, truly solved, why did it still feel unfinished? Why did the silence around that final moment remain intact, unbroken by confession or clarity? Because the suspect had said nothing. And as long as he stayed silent, the space between the car and the door remained a void, a place where truth had yet to arrive. And in that void, the cold case waited, not for evidence anymore, but for a voice willing to cross the final distance. Courtrooms are built for order, but cold cases bring disorder with them, decades of unanswered questions compressed into fluorescent light and polished wood. And when proceedings began, the air carried something heavier than procedure, a collective awareness that time itself was on trial alongside the man at the defense table. He sat motionless, suit ill-fitting, hands folded, eyes forward, a posture practiced enough to suggest he had rehearsed this moment long before it arrived. The prosecution moved first, outlining a narrative stitched together from fragments once dismissed as insignificant, emphasizing how the absence of evidence in 1998 was not the absence of a crime, but the absence of tools. They spoke of parking lots and routines, of opportunities shaped by predictability, of a man drifting through lives without leaving fingerprints until science learned how to read what he left behind. Jurors listened, some nodding, some guarded, all aware that they were being asked to bridge a gap spanning a generation. The defense countered with restraint, warning against the seduction of hindsight, reminding the court that memory is unreliable and technology, however advanced, is not infallible. They argued that the suspect had been living his life when suddenly it was reinterpreted through the lens of tragedy, that proximity was not guilt, that pattern was not proof. They spoke of coincidence with conviction, of how easily a story can be constructed when the ending is already known. Witnesses took the stand, voices trembling as they revisited moments they had buried years ago. A neighbor described headlights extinguishing too quickly. A former coworker recalled strange absences. Each account added texture but not resolution, reinforcing the truth that cold cases are rarely solved by a single revelation, but by accumulation, a slow convergence of small certainties. The DNA expert testified last, explaining probabilities and processes in language stripped of drama, reducing the case to numbers and margins, to sequences that either aligned or didn't. The match was strong, overwhelming even. Not absolute, but close enough to redraw the map of doubt. The defense cross-examined aggressively, probing for contamination, for human error, for reasonable alternatives, but the science held, indifferent to implication. Outside the courthouse, the media framed the day as historic, microphones catching sound bites about closure and justice, about a community finally freed from an old shadow. But inside, the victim's family sat rigid, understanding that verdicts are not endings, only declarations, and that even a guilty ruling could not return what had been taken or explain how it had happened. As days stretched into weeks, the trial became less about discovery and more about endurance. Jurors absorbed timelines and testimonies, learning the geography of a parking lot as intimately as their own homes, memorizing routes and angles, seconds and steps. The suspect remained silent throughout, his expression unchanged, a constant reminder that some truths are not extracted, only surrendered. Then came the waiting. Deliberations began behind closed doors, speculation raging outside. Experts debated the strength of cold case prosecutions. Commentators argued whether justice delayed was justice compromised. The victim's name trended again, tethered now to possibility rather than absence, and the community held its breath, uncertain whether resolution would finally land or slip away once more. When the verdict was read, it arrived without spectacle. Words spoken plainly, consequences immense. The court acknowledged the weight of evidence, the passage of time, the inevitability of doubt, and rendered judgment accordingly. For some, it was vindication. For others, discomfort. For the family, it was something quieter, a release that felt less like relief and more like exhaustion. Yet even as the legal chapter closed, the story refused to settle. No confession followed. No reconstruction of that night. No admission of intent or detail. The suspect was taken away, the system satisfied that it had done what it could, while the unanswered questions remained intact, resilient against verdicts and sentences. Years later, people would still ask what happened in those final moments, whether fear came first or surprise, whether there was a chance to escape, whether anyone noticed. The cold case had been solved on paper, but in memory, it stayed unresolved, a reminder that some mysteries are not defined by their outcomes, but by the silence they leave behind. And in that silence, the parking lot still existed, unchanged, ordinary, waiting, a place where a routine ended and a question began, one that even justice could not fully erase. The sentence was handed down with the same neutrality that governs all courtrooms, measured words carrying the weight of decades. And when the gavel fell, it marked not an ending but a transition, the moment when a case stops belonging to detectives and lawyers and begins living inside the collective memory as something both answered and incomplete. Outside, cameras captured reactions, tears, clenched jaws, statements prepared in advance, while inside, the air felt hollow, as if something essential had slipped past unnoticed. The man was led away again, slower this time, escorted not by urgency but by finality, and still he said nothing. No acknowledgement of the woman whose name had followed him into every headline. No explanation. No narrative to counter the one built around him. Silence became his last defense, a barrier no verdict could cross, and for those who had waited so long, that silence felt like one final theft. Investigators returned to their offices carrying boxes that would soon be archived again, this time labeled solved, a word that felt precise in reports and inadequate in conversation. They reviewed what they had, what they never found, what might have been different if technology had arrived sooner, if witnesses had spoken louder, if attention had lingered longer. Cold cases encourage that kind of thinking, the endless revision of history that offers no real comfort. In the community, life resumed its ordinary rhythm, but the disappearance lingered like a scar, visible only when the light hit it right. The grocery store parking lot was repaved, lines repainted, cameras upgraded. Yet people still remembered where it happened, pointing it out to newcomers as if the asphalt itself carried memory. Parents warned their children. Neighbors watched strangers more closely. Safety became something discussed rather than assumed. The victim's family faced a different challenge, learning how to live with answers that arrived too late to heal cleanly. They sorted through old belongings, letters, photographs frozen in time, artifacts of a life interrupted, and tried to integrate the knowledge of what had likely happened with the person they remembered. Grief shifted shape, no longer suspended by uncertainty, but anchored now by fact, heavy and undeniable. Occasionally, new theories surfaced, alternative explanations whispered online, questions about accomplices, about overlooked suspects, about whether the man convicted had acted alone or represented something broader, something never fully uncovered. Detectives reviewed them dutifully, closing doors one by one, knowing that speculation thrives where silence persists. The science that cracked the case became its own subject of fascination, celebrated as proof that time favors truth, that no one truly escapes what they leave behind. Conferences cited it. Articles praised it. Other families took hope from it, reopening their own long-dormant files, wondering if somewhere, in some forgotten box, their answers waited too. Justice, it seemed, had learned to be patient. Yet patience did not guarantee completeness. Without a confession, the final minutes remained a blank space, resistant to reconstruction. The walk from car to door stayed abstract, a sequence of possibilities rather than events. And perhaps that was the final lesson of the case, that even when a cold case is declared solved, it may never surrender its most intimate truths. Years later, anniversaries would pass quietly, marked by brief mentions, by a single photograph reposted, by a line acknowledging that the case once haunted this place and no longer did, at least officially. But memory is not official. It keeps its own records, and in those records, the story remained open, a reminder that some crimes leave answers behind, and some leave only echoes. And somewhere between closure and absence, between justice and understanding, the cold case continued to exist, not as an investigation anymore, but as a presence subtle and persistent, woven into the identity of a community that would never forget how quickly the ordinary can fracture, and how long it can take for the truth to find its way back. Time did what it always does after a verdict. It slowed. The headlines faded, the satellite trucks disappeared, and the courthouse steps returned to being just steps, no longer a stage for microphones and emotion. But inside the institutions that had carried the case for so long, the work didn't stop. It shifted. Cold cases don't truly end when a sentence is passed. They change shape, becoming references, precedents, warnings folded quietly into training manuals and late-night conversations between detectives who know how rare this kind of resolution really is. The evidence was sealed, cataloged with care, each item now frozen in a different kind of permanence. The fibers that once meant nothing. The trace DNA that waited decades to speak. The grainy photos printed on paper already yellowing at the edges. Together they formed a story the system accepted as truth, even if parts of it were still missing, even if no one could say with certainty what words were spoken, what fear sounded like, what resistance looked like in that final moment. The man in prison adjusted to a routine he had never planned for, his world reduced to schedules and counts, his name still appearing occasionally in articles about advances in forensic science, about how the past catches up, about how no crime is ever truly forgotten. He did not grant interviews. He did not write letters. He did not confess. Silence remained his currency, traded now not for freedom, but for control over the only thing left that belonged solely to him, the narrative of that night. For investigators, the case became a reference point, cited when younger officers asked whether it was worth reopening files older than their own careers. They would talk about patience, about evidence that outlives people, about how routine can be a vulnerability, about how crimes don't always announce themselves with violence and chaos. Sometimes they arrive quietly, wrapped in normality, and leave behind nothing but absence. The victim's family navigated a quieter aftermath, learning that closure is not a moment but a process, uneven and unpredictable. Some days felt lighter, grounded by the knowledge that the man responsible would never walk free again. Other days were heavier, filled with questions that no longer had anyone to ask. The case had given them certainty, but certainty had its own weight. Anniversaries became complicated. Dates once defined by disappearance were now shared with court rulings and sentences, memory layered upon memory. Flowers appeared at the same places year after year, sometimes from strangers, sometimes from people who remembered the fear more than the facts. The community acknowledged these gestures with a kind of respectful distance, aware that this story belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. Behind the scenes, law enforcement agencies across the country revisited their own cold cases, inspired and unsettled by what had happened in California. Boxes were reopened, samples retested, names resurfaced. Not all of them led anywhere. Most didn't. But the belief that answers could still exist, dormant and waiting, changed how silence was interpreted. It was no longer proof of failure. It was potential. Still, questions lingered about whether the case had revealed everything it was meant to. Some detectives wondered privately if there were moments they would never recover, if the truth had arrived incomplete because time had erased too much context. Others argued that justice does not require perfect knowledge, only accountability. The debate never settled. It simply became part of the case's legacy. Occasionally, someone would come forward claiming to remember something new, a detail suddenly sharpened by distance and age. These tips were logged, reviewed, weighed, usually dismissed. Memory, after all, is unreliable, especially when shaped by decades of retelling. Yet each call served as a reminder that the disappearance had never truly left the public consciousness. It had just gone quiet. The parking lot remained unchanged in spirit if not in surface, a space people moved through without thinking until they did, until a story surfaced in conversation or a name triggered recognition. Ordinary places carry extraordinary histories invisibly, and this one was no exception. It existed as both a functional space and a symbol, a reminder of how easily routine can fracture. In professional circles, the case was discussed not as a triumph but as a cautionary tale, proof that justice delayed is fragile, that reliance on future technology is a gamble, and that every overlooked detail carries consequences. It reinforced the importance of preserving evidence, of documenting the mundane, of treating even the quietest scenes as if they might one day speak. And through it all, the absence remained. The woman at the center of the story was still gone, her life measured now in before and after, her memory shaped by what happened rather than who she was. No advancement in science could restore that balance. No sentence could translate loss into fairness. The cold case had been solved in the language of the law, but in the language of human experience, it continued, existing in pauses, in glances, in moments when silence felt heavier than words, a reminder that some answers arrived too late to heal cleanly, and some mysteries, once opened, never fully close. Years passed, and with distance came reinterpretation. The case began to live a second life, not in courtrooms or police briefings, but in classrooms, conferences, documentaries, and late-night discussions where professionals dissected it not for answers, but for meaning. It became an example, a caution, a promise, depending on who was speaking. The facts stayed the same, but the lens kept changing, refracting the story into something larger than the night it began. Detectives who had worked the file found themselves invited to speak about it, asked to explain how patience and technology converged, how evidence could wait quietly until the world was ready to understand it. They spoke carefully, aware that every success story casts a shadow, that for every case reopened, dozens remain sealed by circumstance. They emphasized restraint, discipline, the danger of certainty arriving too early or too late. In these retellings, the woman's name was spoken often, sometimes reverently, sometimes clinically, always tethered to the word cold. Cold case. Cold evidence. Cold years. The language suggested distance, but the emotions beneath it were anything but distant. Those who listened could feel the tension between what was known and what would never be known, the unsettling realization that resolution does not always bring clarity. The suspect's silence became its own subject of analysis. Psychologists speculated about control, about the power of withholding, about how some people define themselves not by what they do, but by what they refuse to give. Others cautioned against interpretation, reminding audiences that silence can mean many things, including nothing at all. Still, the absence of explanation continued to irritate, a splinter lodged beneath the surface of an otherwise concluded story. Inside the prison system, the man's name faded quickly, absorbed into a population defined more by numbers than narratives. He followed rules. He kept to himself. He became unremarkable, another body occupying space, his past flattened by routine. And yet, outside those walls, his actions decades earlier continued to ripple, influencing policy discussions and forensic funding, shaping how future cases would be approached. The victim's family chose a quieter path. They declined most interviews, allowed only limited access to their story, protective now of what remained private. They understood that public attention had played a role in reaching this point, but they also knew its limits. Attention had never brought their loved one back. It had only illuminated the absence more clearly. On certain days, they returned to the place where it began, not out of obligation, but habit. They stood where the car had been parked, traced the path she would have taken, imagined the ordinary thoughts that might have filled her mind in those final moments. These were not reconstructions meant to solve anything. They were acts of remembrance, quiet and personal, resistant to analysis. In law enforcement circles, the case influenced how evidence was handled going forward. Storage protocols were revised. Old boxes were treated with renewed respect. What had once been considered peripheral was now preserved with the understanding that relevance is often a matter of timing. The lesson was simple and unsettling. The future may judge the present by what it chooses not to discard. Yet for all the procedural changes, the emotional core of the case remained unresolved. People continued to ask whether justice had been done or merely approximated. Whether accountability without explanation was enough. Whether the system had succeeded or simply caught up too late. These questions had no official answers, and perhaps that was their purpose, to resist closure and demand humility. The story began appearing in other forms, adapted, condensed, dramatized, sometimes losing nuance in the process. Each retelling emphasized different elements: the science, the suspense, the human cost. Some framed it as a victory, others as a warning. All acknowledged its haunting persistence, the way it refused to settle neatly into a single category. For younger generations, the case was history, something that happened before smartphones and omnipresent cameras, before digital footprints became unavoidable. It served as a reminder of a time when disappearance could still be nearly total, when a person could slip out of view with terrifying efficiency. That knowledge carried its own unease, a recognition of vulnerability that technology has not entirely erased. And through all of this, the unanswered questions remained untouched by time. What words were exchanged, if any? Whether there was a moment of recognition, a chance encounter that turned irreversible. Whether fear arrived suddenly or crept in slowly. These details stayed locked away, unreachable, existing only in speculation and imagination. The cold case, though solved in record books and legal archives, continued to breathe in these spaces, sustained by curiosity, by doubt, by the human need for narrative completeness. It was no longer an investigation, but it was not a relic either. It occupied a middle ground, where facts and feelings coexist without fully aligning. And as long as people continued to walk through ordinary places, unaware of the histories beneath their feet, the story endured, not as a caution shouted aloud, but as a quiet reminder that the past does not disappear when it is solved. It simply learns how to wait in a different way. The longer the case existed in the world, the more it detached from the night itself and embedded into the idea of what a cold case represents, a symbol rather than an event. And symbols have a way of growing larger than their origins. People spoke about it with certainty now, even those who hadn't lived through the fear of 1998, as if distance had clarified what proximity never could. They debated details with confidence, filling gaps with logic, smoothing uncertainty into something easier to hold, forgetting that the original investigators had stared into those same gaps and found only darkness. Inside police departments, the case was referenced when difficult decisions arose, when resources were limited, when commanders had to choose which files deserved another look. It became shorthand for perseverance, for the idea that time could be an ally instead of an enemy. But it also carried a quieter warning, one rarely spoken aloud, that success stories distort expectations, that for every solved cold case held up as proof, countless others remain unresolved, their evidence degraded beyond usefulness, their witnesses gone, their truths buried too deep to recover. The science continued to advance, faster now, algorithms refined, databases expanded, genetic genealogy becoming more precise and more controversial with each breakthrough. The case was cited in arguments both for and against these methods. Advocates pointed to justice delivered after decades of silence. Critics questioned consent, privacy, the reach of the state into biological identity. The woman's disappearance, once a local tragedy, now intersected with global debates about how far society should go in pursuit of answers. Meanwhile, the physical places connected to the case continued to exist without acknowledgement. The grocery store changed ownership. New signage went up. Employees came and went, most unaware of what had happened there years before. The parking lot filled and emptied every day, cars sliding into the same spaces, people walking the same paths, their routines echoing one another without knowing it. History, invisible and indifferent, watched as repetition replaced memory. Occasionally, someone would pause there longer than necessary, staring at nothing in particular, remembering a news segment or a documentary, feeling an unease they couldn't fully explain. These moments passed quickly, absorbed back into the flow of ordinary life, but they were reminders that certain places retain emotional residue, even when their surfaces are scrubbed clean. The victim's family marked time differently now. They no longer counted years since disappearance, but years since resolution, a subtle shift that changed how anniversaries felt. The sharp edge of uncertainty was gone, replaced by something heavier and more permanent. They spoke less about the crime itself and more about who she had been, reclaiming her identity from the narrative that had consumed it for so long. They learned to recognize the difference between curiosity and care. Some inquiries came from a place of genuine respect. Others felt extractive, seeking emotion more than understanding. Over time, they set boundaries, understanding that their grief was not public property, even if the case had become a public reference point. Silence, once imposed on them, became something they could choose. In the prison where the man served his sentence, time moved predictably, measured in counts and meals and routines that flattened individuality. He aged quietly, his relevance outside those walls diminishing with each passing year. New cases replaced his in headlines. New technologies emerged. Yet the absence of a confession continued to exert a strange pull, a sense that something essential remained unfinished, unresolved not legally, but morally. Some believed he would eventually speak, that age or illness would loosen his grip on silence. Others doubted it, arguing that confession would offer him nothing but a loss of the only leverage he still held. The system waited, but without expectation. Experience had taught it not to rely on remorse. As the case settled into history, it began to influence how people understood disappearance itself. The myth of instant resolution, fueled by television and fiction, was challenged by the reality of decades-long uncertainty. The idea that answers arrive neatly was exposed as fantasy. Instead, the case illustrated how truth often arrives fragmented, incomplete, and late, demanding acceptance rather than satisfaction. Younger investigators absorbed these lessons in quieter ways, internalizing the importance of documentation, of resisting assumptions, of preserving even the smallest trace. They learned that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that patience, while not a strategy on its own, is sometimes the only option available. Still, the emotional core of the case remained resistant to closure. People continued to imagine the final moments, not out of morbid fascination, but out of a need to restore narrative balance, to replace randomness with intention, to understand how the ordinary can tip so suddenly into the irreversible. These imaginings varied, but all ended in the same place: silence. The cold case, once a question, now existed as a presence, shaping conversations about safety, memory, and justice without announcing itself. It reminded people that the line between known and unknown is thinner than it appears, that lives can intersect briefly and catastrophically without warning, and that answers, when they come, do not always arrive with relief. In this way, the case continued, not as an investigation, not as a trial, but as a shadow woven into the fabric of collective awareness, subtle yet persistent, waiting not for resolution anymore, but for understanding, something far rarer and far more difficult to achieve. Understanding, when it came, arrived unevenly, settling in some places and refusing others, because comprehension is not a single act but a slow accumulation, and the case demanded more of it than most people were prepared to give. With distance, the story lost its urgency but gained weight, transforming from breaking news into a quiet reference point that surfaced whenever conversations drifted toward trust, safety, or the fragile assumption that routine is protection enough. Law enforcement agencies continued to cite the case when justifying investments in forensic technology, pointing to the moment when dormant evidence finally found a voice. They spoke of progress as inevitability, as if the arc of science naturally bends toward truth, but those who had lived with the case knew better. Progress had been uneven. It had required preservation, patience, and luck in equal measure. Without any one of those, the outcome might have been very different. The case file itself grew heavier over time, not with new evidence, but with context. Articles, analyses, academic references. It became a document not just of a crime, but of an era, capturing the limitations of late 1990s investigations and the evolving standards of proof that followed. Reading it now felt like reading a record of absence, a chronicle of what could not be known when it mattered most. The victim's absence continued to shape lives in subtle ways. Friends who had once waited for her calls learned to stop expecting them. Colleagues remembered her in fragments, a laugh, a habit, a way of standing slightly off to one side in group conversations. These memories survived independently of the case, resistant to the labels attached to her name. She existed for them outside the narrative of disappearance, though the two could never be fully separated. For the broader public, the case became a benchmark against which other unresolved crimes were measured. Whenever a disappearance lingered too long, comparisons emerged, hopeful and impatient, asking whether this too might one day be solved by a future discovery, a forgotten sample, a database not yet built. The comparison offered comfort, but it also created expectation, a belief that time alone would eventually produce answers. Those closest to the investigation knew the danger of that belief. Time, they understood, is just as capable of erasing as it is of revealing. Evidence degrades. Witnesses die. Context dissolves. The California case had survived largely because enough fragments remained intact long enough to matter. It was not proof that time heals investigations. It was proof that neglect can be fatal to them. Within the prison walls, the man's world continued to narrow. He marked years not by headlines or anniversaries, but by routine transfers, cell assignments, the gradual erosion of physical resilience. His relevance to the outside world faded, but his silence retained its significance, an unanswered question lingering stubbornly in the public imagination. Some interpreted it as guilt beyond doubt. Others saw it as defiance. Few believed it was accidental. Occasionally, speculation arose that he might have left clues somewhere, a journal, a letter, something hidden that could one day surface and complete the story. None ever did. The silence proved durable, immune to curiosity, resistant to pressure. It became a fixed point around which all interpretation rotated, frustrating and immovable. The place where it all began remained unchanged in the most unsettling way. It did not mark itself. No plaque, no sign, no official acknowledgement. It remained a functional space, stripped of ceremony, forcing anyone who remembered the case to reconcile the extraordinary with the mundane. People parked there without knowing. They walked the same distances, counted the same steps unconsciously, unaware of the history beneath their feet. This invisibility disturbed some more than any monument could have. It suggested how easily stories can vanish without deliberate preservation, how quickly tragedy can be absorbed back into normality. Memory, without reinforcement, fades. And yet the case persisted, not through markers, but through repetition, through telling and retelling, through its role as cautionary reference. In academic circles, the case was used to illustrate the psychological toll of unresolved trauma, not just on families, but on communities. The prolonged uncertainty, followed by partial resolution, created a complex emotional arc that defied traditional models of closure. Students studied it not for its conclusion, but for its lingering effects, the way ambiguity reshapes grief rather than ending it. The victim's family adapted again, this time to the realization that the world would eventually move on completely. New cases would replace old ones. Attention would drift. Their story would become one example among many. They prepared for that inevitability quietly, preserving what mattered to them privately, photographs, letters, stories passed down deliberately, so they would not dissolve into abstraction. They spoke sometimes of forgiveness, but not as resolution. Forgiveness, for them, was not a declaration or a performance. It was an internal process, uneven and incomplete, shaped by exhaustion as much as empathy. They did not excuse. They did not forget. They simply learned to carry the weight without letting it define every moment. As years accumulated, the case began to function less as a mystery and more as a mirror, reflecting back the fears and assumptions of those who encountered it. To some, it confirmed faith in justice. To others, it exposed its limits. It asked uncomfortable questions about how much certainty is necessary to move forward, and whether understanding is always required for healing. The idea of a solved cold case proved deceptively simple. Solved for whom? Solved in what way? Solved according to which measure? Legally, the answer was clear. Emotionally, it was fractured. Intellectually, it remained open, inviting reinterpretation with each new perspective. And so the story continued to exist in layers, each one incomplete on its own, each one dependent on the others to form something approaching coherence. The disappearance, the investigation, the silence, the science, the verdict, the aftermath. None could be removed without collapsing the whole. The cold case no longer waited for answers. It waited for people to sit with its complexity, to accept that some truths arrive without clarity, that some resolutions leave echoes rather than conclusions. It asked not to be solved again, but to be remembered accurately, without comfort, without simplification. In that way, the case endured, not as a headline or a lesson, but as a quiet insistence that the ordinary is never as safe as it appears, and that time, while powerful, does not grant understanding freely. It demands attention, patience, and the willingness to accept what cannot be fully known. As the years stacked higher, the case slipped into a different register of memory, no longer urgent, no longer debated nightly, but present in the background like a low-frequency hum, something felt more than heard. It surfaced unexpectedly, in training rooms where recruits listened to veterans explain why evidence must be treated as if it will testify one day, in living rooms where documentaries replayed familiar images, in quiet moments when someone parked a car and felt a brief, irrational pause before stepping away. The system moved forward, refined by lessons learned, shaped by the understanding that disappearance does not announce itself and that violence can wear the mask of normality. Protocols changed. Databases grew. Cooperation expanded across jurisdictions that once guarded information closely. The case became a hinge point, cited when arguing that patience is not passivity, that waiting is sometimes an active choice, the only one available when certainty refuses to arrive on demand. Yet progress carried its own unease. With every technological advance, new questions emerged about reach and restraint, about how much of the past should be re-examined, and at what cost. The case was invoked in these debates as evidence that the search for truth justifies intrusion, that the alternative is silence forever. Others countered that power, once expanded, rarely contracts, and that justice must remain accountable even when its intentions are pure. The woman at the center of the story became an unspoken presence in these arguments, her absence lending gravity without consent. In quieter spaces, the emotional residue continued to shift. People who had lived through the original disappearance found their memories softening at the edges, details blurring, fear transforming into something less sharp but more enduring. Younger listeners absorbed the story without the immediacy of threat, interpreting it through the lens of hindsight, believing, perhaps mistakenly, that awareness alone offers protection. The victim's family grew older, their lives marked by milestones she would never reach. They carried her forward through stories told deliberately, refusing to let her be reduced to a case number or a cautionary tale. In doing so, they reclaimed agency over a narrative that had so often been told without them, asserting that remembrance does not require spectacle, only intention. The man in prison faded further into anonymity, his days indistinguishable from one another, his presence no longer commanding attention. He became, to the institution, a settled matter, to the public a resolved question. And yet, the silence persisted unchanged, immune to the erosion of time. It remained a closed door in a story otherwise laid bare, a reminder that truth is not always compelled by consequence. Occasionally, rumors circulated that he might speak, that age or illness had shifted something, that words might finally arrive to fill the last empty space. They never did. Each unfulfilled expectation reinforced the reality that some knowledge is withheld not because it is fragile, but because it is guarded, protected by the simple refusal to release it. The place where the disappearance began continued its quiet existence, unmarked, unceremonious, a functional space layered over memory. It asked nothing of those who passed through it, offering no warning, no explanation. Its ordinariness became its most unsettling feature, a testament to how easily history can be overwritten by routine, how absence can be absorbed until it feels almost natural. In the broader landscape of unresolved crimes, the case assumed a paradoxical role. It was cited as proof that answers can arrive late, but also as evidence that they rarely arrive whole. It encouraged persistence while cautioning against expectation. It promised justice while revealing its limits. In this way, it resisted simplification, refusing to become a neat parable. Those who studied it closely began to speak less about solving and more about reckoning, about how societies process harm that cannot be undone, about how narratives are constructed to make loss bearable. The case offered no comfort on these questions. It merely exposed them, leaving interpretation to those willing to sit with discomfort. As the world changed around it, accelerating in ways unimaginable in 1998, the disappearance remained anchored to a single, unremarkable moment, a short walk that never completed itself. That contrast between speed and stillness, between progress and permanence, became central to how the case was understood. It was not just about what happened, but about how quickly everything else moved on. In time, the case stopped being referenced by date and began to be referenced by feeling, a shorthand for vulnerability, for the understanding that safety is not guaranteed by familiarity. It entered the cultural vocabulary quietly, invoked without explanation, assumed to be understood by those who remembered and those who had learned. And beneath all of it, the unanswered question endured, not demanding resolution anymore, but acknowledgement. An acceptance that some stories conclude without full clarity, that some endings are administrative rather than emotional, and that justice, when delayed, carries consequences that no verdict can fully repair. The cold case, once defined by uncertainty, now existed as a testament to endurance, not only of evidence and institutions, but of memory itself, stubborn and imperfect, refusing to let the ordinary swallow what should not be forgotten. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA match leads to sudden arrest. Part 11/11. In the end, the case did not close with revelation, but with quiet persistence, settling into the long arc of time where stories lose their sharp edges and become something else entirely. Not resolved, not forgotten, but absorbed into the collective understanding of how fragile certainty can be. What began as a sudden absence in 1998 had transformed into a lesson carried forward, subtle and unresolved, its meaning reshaped by every generation that encountered it. The words cold case solved continued to appear in headlines and summaries, neat and definitive, but those who knew the full weight of the story understood how misleading that phrase could be. Solved implied completeness, an answer for every question, a narrative stitched closed. This case had offered none of that. It had delivered accountability, yes, and confirmation, and a measure of justice defined by law. But it had also left behind a hollow space where explanation should have lived. That hollow space became the true legacy of the case, a reminder that not all truths submit to process, that some remain locked behind choices no system can override. The man who carried those answers kept them, and in doing so, shaped the story as much through silence as through action. His refusal to speak became a final, unintentional statement about power, about control, about the limits of resolution. For the family, time continued to move forward unevenly, moments of peace interrupted by echoes of what had been lost. They learned that grief does not end when questions are answered, only when they are replaced by something else. Memory, ritual, quiet remembrance. These became their anchors, grounding them in a reality that no longer waited for explanations that would never come. They spoke of her often, not as a victim, but as a presence, a person who had existed fully beyond the moment she disappeared. In doing so, they resisted the reduction of a life into a headline, reclaiming identity from circumstance. The case might have defined the public narrative, but it did not define her. For those who studied the case professionally, it became a boundary marker, illustrating how far justice can reach and where it must stop. It demonstrated the power of science without romanticizing it, the importance of persistence without promising reward. It reminded investigators that evidence can endure, but context rarely does, and that waiting for the future is not a strategy, only a possibility. In the places where the story unfolded, life continued without acknowledgement. The parking lot remained just a parking lot. The streets carried traffic without memory. People passed through unaware, their routines intact, their assumptions unchallenged. This quiet continuation felt, to some, like erasure. To others, it was simply how the world works, absorbing disruption until it blends back into the ordinary. Yet the story survived, not through monuments or plaques, but through repetition, through teaching, through caution passed quietly from one person to another. It existed in pauses, in moments of hesitation, in the instinct to look twice, to notice what once might have been overlooked. It shaped behavior in ways impossible to measure, its influence diffuse but real. The cold case no longer asked to be solved. It asked to be understood on its own terms, incomplete, uncomfortable, resistant to narrative satisfaction. It stood as evidence that justice can arrive late and still matter, that answers can be partial and still change lives, and that silence, once allowed to settle, becomes part of the truth whether anyone wants it to or not. In that sense, the case never truly ended. It simply stopped moving. It remained where it began, in that small, unremarkable space between routine and rupture, between the known and the unknowable. A place where a life diverged from expectation and the world, briefly and irrevocably, changed course. And long after the headlines faded, long after the verdict was archived, the story continued to exist in its most honest form, not as a conclusion, but as a question that no amount of time could fully answer, echoing quietly through memory, through ordinary places, through the understanding that some absences never stop speaking. In the end, the case does not conclude with a door slamming shut, but with a room left half-lit, the kind of space where shadows remain even after the lights are turned on. The arrest, sudden and clinical, rippled outward like a shockwave that never quite found a wall to crash against. It changed records, altered headlines, rewrote timelines, yet something essential remained untouched, suspended in that quiet gap between proof and understanding. The phrase cold case solved settles uneasily over the story. It sounds final, almost triumphant, but the people closest to it feel the weight of its inaccuracy. Solved suggests clarity. Solved suggests relief. What this case delivered was confirmation without confession, accountability without explanation. Justice, yes, but justice stripped down to its bare legal bones, absent the human context that might have made it feel complete. The man identified by DNA became the center of a story he refused to tell. In interviews, in court, in every moment where words could have filled the silence, he chose restraint. That silence hardened over time, becoming a boundary no one could cross. Investigators pressed, families waited, reporters speculated, but nothing came. No motive, no sequence, no final admission. Just a name attached to evidence that had waited decades to speak. For the family, the arrest did not end the long vigil. It altered it. Grief shifted shape, from uncertainty to something more rigid, more permanent. The question of who was answered, but why remained untouched, and that absence echoed louder than any verdict. Closure, they learned, is not delivered by handcuffs or court transcripts. It is built slowly, privately, often without reference to the case at all. They spoke of her not in the language of evidence, but in memory. In fragments of laughter, habits, routines that had once seemed ordinary and now felt irreplaceable. They resisted the narrative that reduced a life to a disappearance, refusing to let the final chapter overwrite everything that came before it. In their telling, she was not a cold case. She was a presence interrupted, not erased. Among investigators, the case became a quiet benchmark, a reminder that persistence can outlast time, that science can resurrect voices long buried, but also that resolution has limits. DNA can place someone at the center of a crime, but it cannot reconstruct intention, fear, or impulse. It can answer who, sometimes how, but rarely why. That missing dimension became the case's final lesson. The locations tied to the story returned to anonymity. Streets filled with traffic. Buildings changed hands. People moved through without noticing the invisible residue of what had occurred there years earlier. The world reclaimed its routines, indifferent and efficient, as it always does. To outsiders, nothing marked these places as significant. To those who knew, they remained charged with meaning, ordinary surfaces layered over extraordinary absence. The case lingered not through memorials or plaques, but through cautionary memory. Through the way stories are told in lowered voices. Through the instinct to pay attention, to question assumptions, to recognize how quickly normalcy can fracture. Its influence spread quietly, shaping behavior without demanding recognition. And so the story settles into its final state, not resolved, not unresolved, but suspended. A case that moved from mystery to evidence without ever reaching understanding. A narrative where justice arrived late and incomplete, carrying answers that could be proven but not explained. A reminder that some truths remain locked inside those who refuse to share them, and that silence, once chosen, becomes part of the record. Long after the headlines fade, long after the files are archived, the case continues to exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt. Not as a conclusion, but as an echo. A quiet, persistent reminder that some absences never stop speaking, and that even when a cold case is declared solved, its shadow can remain, stretching forward through time unanswered. The story does not end when the microphones are switched off. It drifts quietly into the spaces where attention fades and certainty thins. Years pass, and the case becomes something people think they remember, not something they actively carry. Yet beneath that surface calm, the unresolved weight remains, pressing gently, persistently, like a low-frequency hum no one fully escapes. In official records, the case is marked complete. Boxes sealed. Evidence logged. Timelines fixed in place. A finality that looks convincing on paper. But in lived experience, nothing feels finished. The arrest did not rewind time. It did not restore what was taken or smooth the fractures left behind. It only confirmed that the absence had always been intentional, shaped by a choice made in a moment no one else witnessed. The silence of the accused becomes louder with distance. As years stretch forward, that refusal to speak hardens into legacy. It becomes the last active decision in a case defined by disappearance. In that way, control persists even after conviction, extending influence beyond freedom, beyond movement, beyond relevance. Silence becomes the final instrument. For the community, memory thins unevenly. Some recall the shock vividly, the way fear briefly rearranged daily habits, the way doors were locked earlier, streets crossed more quickly. Others know the case only as a reference point, a story inherited rather than experienced. A cautionary tale without edges, softened by time but not erased. New investigators study the file with fresh eyes, hoping distance might reveal what proximity concealed. They trace timelines already traced, examine statements already weighed, searching for the one overlooked detail that might still speak. But the record resists expansion. What exists exists. What was lost remains lost. The case offers no more than it already has. Technology continues to advance, promising clarity, precision, answers. But even as tools evolve, the core mystery does not yield. Science can refine facts, sharpen probabilities, confirm presence. It cannot manufacture truth where none was preserved. It cannot compel confession. It cannot fill the emotional vacuum left behind. The family adapts to a permanence they never chose. They learn to live alongside unanswered questions without expecting them to dissolve. Grief becomes quieter, more integrated, less sharp but no less real. It shows up unexpectedly, in ordinary moments, when memory collides with routine. There is no dramatic release, only endurance. They come to understand that resolution is not a single event, but a long negotiation with reality. That peace, if it arrives at all, does so gradually, built from acceptance rather than explanation. The case no longer defines every moment, but it never fully recedes. It becomes background, a constant presence that shapes perception without demanding attention. Public interest shifts elsewhere, to newer stories, fresher shocks. Headlines cycle. Outrage moves on. The case slips into archival status, retrieved occasionally for reference, for comparison, for reminder. Its power diminishes externally, even as it remains internally potent for those it touched. And so the narrative settles into its final, uneasy form. Not a triumph. Not a tragedy with a clean ending, but a testament to the limits of knowledge and the endurance of consequence. A story where evidence spoke louder than people, where answers arrived without understanding, where justice appeared but closure did not. Long after the dates blur and the names lose immediacy, the case continues to exist as a quiet marker in time, proof that some stories do not resolve into meaning. They simply persist. And in that persistence, they remind us that the absence of answers is not emptiness, but a presence of its own, lingering, unyielding, and impossible to fully leave behind.